Thank you very much for such a warm introduction, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. Well, it's tonight, my time, because I'm in Edinburgh in Scotland. And Edinburgh in Scotland, of course, is where Adam Smith did a lot of his thinking when he invented modern day capitalism. And the book I wrote, Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions, is all about looking back at that time, the 18th century in Scotland, and looking at the kind of worldview he had that essentially established the rules of capitalism, and looking at whether those rules still hold true for those of us in a global economy now. And the topic this evening is, can capitalism be healed? Because what I'd noticed about 5 years ago now was that capitalism was broken but healable. And it gives me no satisfaction to see that the COVID crisis has rather proven the thesis of my book, but in a way that none of us would have foreseen or welcome. I can only apologise and feel a deep sense of shame that my voice wasn't loud enough to have turned the ship in time, along with so many other people who have been fighting to try and reform capitalism before it broke so catastrophically as it has been doing in the last few weeks and months. So it feels ever more urgent for us to be having this conversation. As you heard, my doctorate was in theology and capitalism, and I've written quite a lot about that. But this book was written from a very secular viewpoint in order to try and appeal to as many people as possible. So what I will say will start off being much more heavy on economics, but I hope what you will hear coming through loud and clear is my faith and my theology, and why I think God is speaking to us through this time about how we can heal capitalism together, and the role that the church in particular, because of its scale and size globally, could do to lead the way with that. So my book deals with 7 toxic assumptions, and I'm going to deal with each of those briefly in turn, just to set the context for where we're seeing these fault lines particularly worsening under the COVID crisis. One of the first features of capitalism is the invisible hand. Now, this was a particular invention of Adam Smith's that he had actually written about in some other works before it appeared in The Wealth of Nations, and was a convenient way to describe what seems to happen in a market where everyone is individually doing their own thing, seeking their utility, competing away, and somehow that tends towards the good. That's the idea. The rest of us should stand well back and let the market function without any state intervention at all, because the invisible hand will make sure that everything works out all right. The problem is that Adam Smith never meant that to be a descriptive fact, a scientific rule. He himself admitted that the invisible hand was, in his view, psychic balm, which was to calm us all down about the sheer complexity of the thing. And what we're seeing on the streets right now is that the invisible hand is a very convenient cloak to hide the powers. Because what happens if you stand well back is the market gets colonized by the rich for the rich. All markets are messages of supply and messages of demand meeting up in the middle. And it so happens that if you are the rich elite, you have more messages to put into the market. You have more votes. And so what happens if you leave the market to it and let the invisible hand make good is what happens is the rich make good, as we're seeing all too clearly now. So I think it's time for us to call that out and to notice in particular that the invisible hand at the moment has COVID, and that actually we're seeing that collapsing all around the world. And it's time for us to expose that and to notice that actually it is all about the messages that we personally are sending into the market, and the messages that are sent on our behalves by every country that we're in your case in America, who you're voting for, where you're shopping, all that kind of stuff, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail as we go through. So the idea behind the invisible hand was that we're all utility-seeking machines, that economic man, again, the language, economic man is hell-bent on maximizing their own utility. And utility is very much seen in that very old-fashioned utilitarian way of maximizing the good for you personally. And the idea in neoclassical thinking is that if everyone simultaneously does that on their own, the invisible hand will fix it. What we're learning through COVID-19 is we don't like utility, because utility is about deciding that actually Black lives, old lives, weak lives don't matter, because coronavirus only attacks those people. Well, it doesn't, it attacks everyone, of course, but it particularly attacks those vulnerable groups because they have less protection. In the UK, there has been a covert strategy of herd immunity, which is entirely fine from a utilitarian point of view, because it is about trying to create the greatest good for the greatest number in Bentham's phraseology, but it means you have to sacrifice a lot of lives. And everybody is realizing that while that idea of utility might kind of stack up in terms of public policy, it actually makes us sick to our stomachs, and it makes us feel really dirty and wrong. And in some ways that I think is very good, because all around the world, people are calling out bad behavior, that even though it may be obeying a rule, even though it may be intended towards a good, if it's not virtuous, we're starting to notice that our consciences don't sit right with that. So utility for what? What does, again, that cloak? That can cloak incredibly selfish behavior, as we're seeing. So as well as utility in the invisible hand, there is this other thing in the Holy Trinity called competition. So if the markets, all the players in the markets are being individually competitive and we're individually maximizing our utility, that means that the market keeps improving, we keep increasing our utility, and the invisible hand makes everything all right. Competition, though, we're finding at the moment is getting in the way of solving this global crisis. The fights we're having on who gets vaccines, who is going to have first dibs on the PPE globally, who gets the orders first through globally in terms of supply chain, all that stuff is not about cooperation. And companies are really struggling in sectors to rescue the whole sector because they are prevented from doing so by antitrust law. In the UK, there was recently an announcement by our competition authority to stop the boarding schools talking to each other because that was anti-competitive behaviour, when all they were trying to do was figure out what on earth do you do socially distance learning, in order to save the entire sector and create an opportunity for people to choose that as opposed to something else. So the thing about competition is it doesn't stack up in terms of maths. If you look at the game theory behind it, cooperation always yields better outcomes unless you're never going to see the other party again, like in a war, which is what it's all based on. Competition can be a very good selective strategy, but to make it an absolute law of any system means you're baking in incredibly wasteful duplication of effort. And what we need in order to recover from COVID and to heal the market is a lot more cooperation between the parties, so we share the information we all have in order to define better outcomes. Then my next two of the big seven, the fourth and the fifth, are really mixed together in the public imagination because they're coming from a very similar place: shareholder value and limited liability. So shareholder value has been particularly famous in America, but it has attacked all Western markets really, which is the idea that the only business of business is business. And the only thing that matters is maximizing shareholder value. And what that has meant is systematic robbery, really. There's been no investment in the workforce, in R&D. It's all been stripped out in order to inflate share prices, because we have now decided that, another of my big seven is agency theory, that in order to persuade recalcitrant chief execs from being naughty and doing the wrong thing, we must bribe them with shares in order to align their interests with the shareholders' interests. So you now have chief execs whose sole focus is jacking up the share price and not actually running the enterprise that they're in charge of. So what we have seen in this crisis is a whole load of companies who've gone crazy on debt, because debt is cheaper than equity. You can get a load of money in and then you can use that for share buybacks to inflate the share price to help jack up shareholder value and improve the position of those on stock options in the boardroom. So what we're finding is companies have nowhere to go. They have no spare money, they have no cushion. We've all gone mad on lean and just in time and no inventory, and all of a sudden supply chains have packed up. And I know unemployment figures in the US are already around 15% and will only get worse. So a real problem with that thinking that has become incredibly obvious in this particular crisis, and makes me think that that very lazy assumption that we don't really need to think about other stakeholders unless we're playing to the gallery on a kind of corporate social responsibility agenda, that license to operate has run out. And what we're noticing, particularly in terms of agency theory, is those assumptions we had about the recalcitrance of mankind and that you have to manipulate them, bribe them into good behavior. Actually, there has been spontaneous, beautiful behavior breaking out all over the world as we've had to deal with this together. I know we're also seeing some very bad behavior too, but most of us have got stories of extraordinary kindness in our communities as people look out for each other and try and help the vulnerable. And that really exposes one of the particular assumptions that was why I got into this from a Christian point of view, which is that our view of mankind, our view of humanity, is that we are perfectly made in God's image for God's ends. And why would we need all these measures in order to persuade us to do good when we have that radar already fitted? So that very, I guess it's kind of an old-fashioned Freudian view of human psychology is very anti-Christian, but it drives a huge amount of our discourse in organizations around the need for unions and the need for HR practices that are all about compelling behavior and attendance and objective setting, all those kinds of things. We're learning now when people are working from home just how productive and creative they can be, where they're not chained to their desks in the way that this kind of thinking would have us have them. So just to finish off on another couple, the limited liability is about there being no risk. In the UK, 98% of all companies registered are limited liability vehicles, which means that there is no downside. You don't lose your shirt, you lose a very small amount of the share price that you put up front. And actually what that means is that boardrooms are taking extraordinary risks because there is really no comeback, which is why they've all taken out such extraordinary amounts of debt, which is the reason so many of them are collapsing now. And if we were to have better and more diverse models of ownership to do with employee ownership, to do with partnerships, cooperatives, other vehicles, the B Corp movement, which is growing worldwide, we would have a better ecology of business models to weather these kinds of storms. The last one that I'd like to finish off of my 7 is market pricing, which may sound quite specific, but I want to talk about it because one of the things we're hearing a lot about in Britain, I don't know if this is the same in the US, is how much people are loving birdsong. They're marooned at home and it's beautiful springtide and there aren't really any planes and there aren't very many cars and people are all of a sudden hearing birdsong. And that is fueling a real awakening and understanding about what we mean by global warming. They're also really enjoying living in their communities and nurturing each other and learning what those links mean and that they were there all the time, even though they were busy rushing off to work and commuting every day. And we're starting to notice all those other things in life that are actually crucially important to our well-being. And what's happened with market pricing, which is again another key component, an absolute assumption within capitalism, is that we have stripped out any conversation about what they would call externalities, all those other things that the market free rides on, like education and fresh air and good systems of law and nature and the environment and all of these other things. So there is now time for us to insist on looking at all those hidden costs. When you see a sweater that is $5, it doesn't cost $5. What it costs is an awful lot more than that when you look back down the supply chain and see what it means for the families who are involved. So one thing that the churches have done beautifully worldwide is to overpay, to pay back those externalities through initiatives like fair trade and buying from ethical places. And that's really where I want to finish this little session and very much welcome questions about details I haven't covered, which is that one of my big realizations thinking about this crisis is the word economics. It's from the Greek oikonomia, which means the management of the household. And what's happened with lockdown is instead of us imagining economics as something on the financial pages or in Wall Street or the city, suddenly the household has become really pivotal, figuring out if we have groceries, if we have energy and money to pay our energy bills, if we have Wi-Fi in order to have Zooms and other kinds of online conferences. Actually thinking about our families as the cornerstone of an economy has become very real to very many more of us than ever before. And that gives me great hope that if we can have that Copernican revolution again to bring markets home to us and to really think about the real economy, we may be able to start the healing from there. One of the books that I wrote was called Buying God, and it was about a theology of consumerism, and I want to finish dwelling on that a little. I started by talking about messages for supply and demand and the myth of the invisible hand. And if you think about those messages, the messages going in about supply and about demand, that's all about what we do individually in the market. In the UK, they reckon about 70% of GDP is consumer spending. So if consumer spending changes, the market changes overnight. We've seen that by, I don't know if this is the case in the US, but it's no longer acceptable to buy a plastic straw here. That vanished within a space of weeks when it suddenly became just not acceptable to have single-use plastic of that kind. We saw it with the transformation of the fair trade coffee market and other markets like that. When consumers vote with their feet, it's much quicker than any public or government policy could ever be to change the way markets function. One thing I do is I have my bank statements. I don't know what yours looks like. This is one of mine. And what I do is I think about my bank statement as my report card. So if I'm talking to St. Peter at the pearly gates and he says, I want to check out your economic activity, this is what I would have to show him, because you can't hide from your bank statement. It is the sum total of every transaction you've made in the market, what you've been paid, any money you've made from investments or pensions or anything like that, all the expenditure you've had, whether you've given to charity, which shops you've gone to, whether you've shopped online or local shops. And what I've done with mine is I've red, amber, greened it. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. And the greens are all a vote for the kingdom. The reds are a vote for mammon. And the ambers are stuff I need to work on to get them to green. And my challenge to you in terms of your role in healing the market is to work your bank statement. At the moment, that's kind of a bit strange for most of us because we're restricted to an awful lot of online purchasing. But again, you can still analyze who you're shopping with online. Where does their money go? And as soon as you can, whether or not you're able to at the moment, please shop local. There was a really interesting study done by the New Economics Foundation in the UK, where they tried to track what happens to your pound when you spend it. And they had this concept called blue hands, and they thought about this pound, I guess it would be like $1, and they wanted to know when you handed it over, they imagined that everyone in your community had been like at messy church or they'd been painting or something, they had blue paint on their hands, and they wanted to know how much blue paint could you get on that dollar, on that pound, before it would end up, in a bank vault somewhere. So they did a study and they found that if you took your pound and you went to a chain store, like a Walmart or a Tesco in this country, something like that, they found that that pound ended up being worth about 36 pence because you basically gave it over to the cashier and it went straight down to London or offshore somewhere and was kind of done. So it kind of was devalued as a contribution to your local economy because of the centralization of all of these big chains and the way they deal with their profits. They found, however, if you took your pound and you went to a local shop, something rather extraordinary happened because the blue hand count went up. So let's imagine you have your pound and you go to your local newsagents to buy a newspaper in the morning, and you hand that pound over and they put it in their till. And then they are getting a bit bored and they think, I could really fancy a coffee. So they take the pound out of the till and they go around the corner to the little coffee bar and they pass the pound over. So it has some blue paint on it. The people in the coffee bar, it's a bit quiet today. So they think, I'll just go and get my hair cut. So they take the pound out of their till and they take it to the barber shop. More blue hands. The barber is having a bit of a nightmare trying to post a birthday card. So they rush off to the post office in their lunch hour, and they hand it over to the post office. And in this country, we can pay benefits to people through the post office. So an old lady comes in and they give her the pound and she takes it off, and she thinks, oh, well, I'll treat myself to some flowers. So she goes to the flower shop on the corner and gives them the pound. So the pound goes round and round and round, and they found that actually the pound becomes worth £1.76 if you spend it locally because of the halo effect in the local economy. So one way we can absolutely vote our cash for the kingdom is by thinking very, very carefully about where our money goes next. It isn't spent, it keeps moving through the system, and it's a vote. So freak yourself out, Google everything on your bank statement and check out these companies. Are they paying tax properly? Are they signed up to ethical trading initiatives? What are their policies on labor? Because actually, if every vote you make with your money is for the kingdom, we will change the market overnight. And some of that is about investing well in things that you would like to encourage. In Cape Cod, they have a brilliant initiative where they ask you to identify 3 local organizations that you would like to support and to pledge $50 a month just to vote for them, to keep them in business. That is going to be crucial in the recovery from COVID because so many small organizations are going to collapse unless we decide that we are going to support them very proactively and go out of our way to support them by voting our cash. So it's worth you thinking now, what would you miss if you're looking around your neighborhood, your high street, and you know that a large percentage of those places will probably not be here in a year's time? Which ones would you want to save? And how can you start deliberately walking the wrong way, going the long way, paying slightly extra to keep them going because you think they're valuable? And I'm really encouraged by the fact that we have the choice in the first world to vote our cash in solidarity with people all over the world who cannot participate in the market in the way that we can. So that's the other thing, is to think about where are there organizations that maybe I don't need to use, but other people need to use, and they need to be saved for them. And how can I be voting my cash in solidarity with those people so that I can help support the infrastructure that they need? It sounds very simple, but I think actually it's a bit like Naaman and the river. And he went to Elisha, and Elisha said, you know, go and have a bath, bathe in the river. And Naaman was horrified. He wanted some kind of big magic spell, some mumbo jumbo. Actually, you just got to get in the river. All you need to do is spend your money properly and make sure everyone you know would not mind sitting down with you and going through their bank statement, because where your treasure is, there your heart be also. And if we could agree with each other that next time we see each other, we're going to get out our bank statements and go through it and show how we're trying to turn the reds to ambers, the ambers to greens, then I think we will heal this market together. I'll look forward to your questions.